Well, hi, everybody. Another edition of Tarter Sauce. I'm Steve Tarter, and with me today, happy to have Jim Nowlan, who came off the deathbed to get in here.
I know. If I cough, that's...
Well, you won't get it at home, so it's all right. Retired professor, longtime newspaper publisher, and still a columnist.
Yeah, and I always brag that I have worked for 3 unindicted Illinois governors.
We'll get to that one, because your political science resume is so long, we probably won't have time to even get through it all. But Jim, I know we've known each other a while. In the last 10 years, we'll just say 10 years, how would you describe what's happened to newspapers in your world and in the world you view?
Everybody's stealing the eyeballs away from newspapers, and newspapers have to try to figure out how to recapture them, if indeed it will be newspaper. Mm-hmm. I mean, news is what we do, yeah. And paper was the way we always did it. I grew up in a county seat weekly newspaper in Stark County. There were 3 towns. Each had a weekly newspaper. Each had, on average, among the 3, about 1,500 subscribers, paid subscribers. That's 4,500. When my Stark County News...
What is the population of Stark County? It's probably, what, 5,000, 4,500?
Well, back then it was about 8,000. So you had
down, yeah.
You had about 60% of the population subscribing to the newspaper.
Yeah,
well, about a year ago, I folded the Stark County News into a shopper, and it's now called the Prairie News. And at the time the Stark County News folded, it served the whole county and had 1,000 subscribers versus the 4,500 of several decades earlier. So a big challenge,
And it's been a challenge, we talk about it, because, you only have to spin your phone across the dial and find out who's being laid off or who's getting at gatehouse, they're buying each other or whatever. Obviously, huge changes, hedge fund directed changes in the newspaper world, but it really hits rural communities hard, I would think. You've witnessed that.
Well,
or is that a success story? Because
maybe the rural community change hits the newspapers, because when I was a kid, each little town had a busy main street, and that provided advertising for the respective community newspapers. Now, unfortunately, there's not much vitality in our rural downtowns.
We met you were kind enough to invite me to dinner at Bradford. And what is it?
The Highlands.
The Highlands. And a great place, recommend it to anyone who wants to...
Steak and scotch, among other things.
And a lot of other things. Wonderful place. And they had a picture there. And I asked him to send it to me. I haven't seen it yet, but the owner there, of downtown Bradford, probably in the 20s.
900 people.
And the scene was these old cars. We always love old pictures of cars, but parked in downtown Bradford. One line of cars, parked, I guess, diagonally, and then another line
in the center of the street. Yeah.
And I said, well, what happens if, that guy who parked inside the lane wanted to leave? Oh, they left the keys in the car.
Yeah.
So not only did you have double parking back then, but you had a lot of trust.
Yeah.
A whole different world.
Yeah, different world. Yeah.
So that's changed. But now, where do you see it going? Because, those of us who worked on a newspaper, and you still write, and I like to blog, and we do this thing, it's in our blood. But what about for the general public? Where do you see that? What do you see in the future, in your crystal ball?
I think we're all struggling to figure that out, and we're all competing for the eyeballs of the public, and the public often is focused on the smartphone, and so.
That's for sure.
But you can reach a newspaper, an electronic newspaper, through your iPhone. Because I read newspapers online as well as in hard copy. So where does it go? I think the traditional newspaper is probably, for the most part, dead, with some exceptions. Jeff Lampe in Elmwood.
I was going to say, you've got a good example there with Jeff.
Yeah, he has a model that he has used successfully for the Weekly Post, which covers the small towns between Peoria and Galesburg. And now he purchased my Prairie News and is using the same model for an area kind of between Peoria and Kewanee, you might say. And his model is it's different because there are no subscribers. His paper goes to all 100% of the households in his region by mail. So you're guaranteed, if you're an advertiser, that it's going to everybody. And he puts enough news in it that people will page through it. There's some high school sports on the back pages, and there are county and city meetings that are covered, and a columnist and that sort of thing. So he convinces advertisers, which in small cities like Kewanee, Galesburg, and so on, generally can't afford television from the bigger markets because it's inefficient. And so he convinces advertisers, and maybe he doesn't need to convince them, they convince themselves that that's a good way to reach all 100% of the households.
Well, it's targeted.
And that people will page through it because there is some news content in it. It's an expensive model, though, because there are no subscribers, and it's mail, and so he has to produce the product, he has to print it, and he has to mail it. And he has to depend solely on advertising to cover it, but he is doing so. So that's one model. Another is the free alternative newspaper that you pick up that isn't mailed, so it's less expensive, but it doesn't guarantee that it goes to everybody, of course. And so that has to have...
Somebody has to pick it up.
And want to pick it up.
Yeah, want to pick it up.
And you and I were talking earlier in Springfield, there's a paper called the Illinois Times, been there about 4 or 5 decades. And people pick it up because they want to find out what's going on. And it doesn't cost anything to pick it up. So there are some different models that work out there. But the old model of subscription that doesn't go to everybody, and which subscriptions are becoming priced out of the market, I think. I'm told $600 and $700 a year for thin newspapers is something that people are rejecting or dropping.
And you know, the story we get, and you probably have heard this too, is that the hedge fund strategy, and this is just, you know, when I'm repeating something that isn't necessarily true, but this is what you hear, was they're going to keep jacking up, they'll reduce the cost of the paper, that is, lay off staff.
Make money until the papers die.
Right, because the paper isn't going to get any cheaper, because they realize an older audience will continue to, that has always been faithful to a newspaper, will want to keep that, you know, sort of for the coffee in the morning, just to have it, just because they always have. And they will milk that group until they're gone. Or until it's so small that it's not a factor, which seems a little insidious. Because you're preying upon the old people. And we're not doing a thing about introducing a paper for the younger ones. And again, as you say, it may not be a paper, but rather a device or something that goes through the air and you pick it up somehow.
What I worry about is the loss of a forum or forums for communities like Peoria. In other words, the Journal Star hasn't had an editorial page for years now, right? And
occasional editorials, I think.
And my column sometimes, that sort of thing.
And they go a lot with the op-ed.
Which is, I'm not complaining, but...
No, and they do have opinion, but it's usually, as you say, that which they receive.
And so, how can we as communities create lively forums? And maybe this studio we're sitting in now is an illustration of the creation of forums or discussions for a community, because leaders and followers need to know what the problems are, what the options are for solving the problems, how to increase the vitality of a community, and argue about these things in a constructive way. And the old printed newspaper used to provide that forum. It used to be 2 and 4 pages were devoted to what we called opinion and perspective.
Now we're segueing into, when you talk about opinions and editorials, I'm thinking, and this is something you hear all the time too, but the polarized position of parties right now, whether we're Republican, Democratic. You can look nationally, you probably can look locally. There seems to be a divide. Now, you have great experience in this. Is it more polarized than before, or how do you see that? Or is it standard?
I think we need perspective on that. And in the 1800s, newspapers were products of the respective political parties.
Right.
And
Lincoln had his own paper.
Yeah. And we had the Quincy Herald Whig. Well, actually, we still do, but we had the Whig and we had the Republican and Democrat named newspapers throughout the country, and that was polarization. So it isn't as if it is new.
Right.
But what worries me is that, in contrast to the 1950s and 60s, when you and I were much younger, there at that time seemed to be a smaller number of forums like CBS News and Walter Cronkite,
Right.
Where most of us went to get our news, and where there was somewhat of a medley or a balance, we thought, to the news. It wasn't rants, as I recall, that you sometimes
Right.
see in the polarized world
Right.
today. So I guess what I worry about is not so much polarization, but less competition from the center against the polls, saying, well, this poll says one
Right.
thing and the other poll says the other. Now, here are some perspectives that, I don't know, look at the strong points and weak points of each poll or what have you. I just worry about that.
And this is supposedly, and I'm just picking Peoria, but we can pick a lot of other different cities in the area or Midwest, but Middle America. I mean, it's often characterized as Peoria, Central Illinois, Middle America. You got sort of a even Steven average person here. I mean, historically, whether it's true or not,
sure.
is up for debate. But if that's the case here, then that's the case, it would seem to be everywhere.
I would guess so. Yeah.
We're talking with Jim Nowlan, who's written books about Illinois' problems, of which you probably could spend the rest of your life doing.
I have warehouses full of books if you're interested.
You look them up online and you'll find all those. But no, the Illinois has got to be, from at least one perspective, a veritable treasure chest of things not to do or what to do. I mean, when you look at how the budget has gone and pensions, all the issues that we're all too familiar with here because we're all paying for it. How do you look at Illinois when you as you write about it, as you work through it?
We all are, well, most of us find things to criticize about Illinois: high taxes, unfunded budgets, and debt, and that sort of thing. But Illinois also has lots of strengths that we fail to appreciate. Our interstate system is probably the most dense in Illinois of any of the states. We have more miles of interstate than any states but Texas and California. Rails, we're the rail hub of the nation.
Not in Peoria, but yeah.
Yeah, but we are. Yeah, that's a good point. But the
I know what you
state
mean.
is,
In Chicago and all
Air,
that. Yeah.
O'Hare is probably the best. It's been reported to be the best for American destinations and international destinations. And water, that's a key. We have copious amounts of water in Illinois that the Southwest is going to covet in years to come.
Sure.
And we're getting warmer.
Yeah. We know it today, but yeah, that's true.
I guess my point is that Illinois still is strong,
Right.
but it's less strong relative to the nation than it used to be because job growth and the economy in Illinois over the past 50 years have been growing more slowly than the rest of the nation. And the fundamental problem at the state level is the fisc, that is the treasury, the fiscal situation. And we're in such a deep hole that it takes high taxes to fund previously underfunded pension obligations, health care through Medicaid that provides health care for 3 million plus Illinoisans, and so on. And this situation requires high taxes that generate moderate to low levels of services because we're spending so much of it to pay for debt in the past. Whereas Minnesota has high taxes, but they generally have a higher level of services that Minnesotans probably grumble about their taxes, but they also like the high level of service.
They get more for their dollar.
Buck, yeah.
But does it concern, because I've heard this, politicians have said it, and I think there's statistics that bear it out, but one wonders about it. People leaving the state because of, I don't know, whatever reason, maybe in search of a job, in search of get with family, whatever it is, they don't like the taxes. Does that concern you?
Yes, and again, perspective is needed. Illinois has been losing white population on a net basis since the 1970s. We've lost about 2 million plus white people on a net basis in the past 3 decades. More whites moving out than moving in on a net basis, often to the south and southwest, often people who can afford to leave for reasons maybe related to climate, often related to climate, and sometimes related to taxes and that sort of thing. For decades, that was offset by an in-migration of African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans. Now, I would quickly add, there's a net outflow of African Americans from Illinois now. Often going south. Maybe life is more amenable down there where some of the roots are to be found than it was 50 years ago. And in recent years, this inflow of Latinos, certainly African Americans, is not an inflow, it's an outflow now, has slowed. So the loss of whites was offset in the past, and so our growth was slow. Now the inflow is dropping off, and so we see a net outflow. And that brings us to the present, which is the controversy over should we increase taxes on the wealthy. And some groups say yes, others say no. The question that is only answered anecdotally is whether doing so will drive more, this gets to your outflow issue, of the well-to-do out of the state. And I worry that it will. Others would say no, they're not going to leave. But
right, yeah. And well, of course, the answer to that one is we'll see. Jim Nowlan's been our guest, and our time flies here, Jim, and you'll have to come back in the new year when you're feeling better, and also as we update the changing media scene, because I think as you and I both have written a lot in the past. You've written books, and are you working on a new book, by the way?
I am working on The Great American Novel.
The Great American Novel. Oh, well, we'll have to hear about that.
I am being commissioned to write a book about Chicago from post-World War II to the end of the century, focusing on some very colorful politicians, people you've never heard of, but who are part of the interstices of Chicago life. And
look that one
up.
It's
going to be, no, actually, it's going to be, I'm working on it now, it's going to be fun.
So it's a nonfiction?
Lightly fictionalized.
Lightly fictionalized.
Yeah. Mostly true.
Mostly true, very good. Well, Jim, we're out of time here, man, but we thank you so much for coming in. we will pay attention to you. When is your project? When you look for it?
A couple of years.
All right. So
18,
we get
18 months is my
all right,
projection.
well, we got time to get back to you on that. Anyway, Jim, thanks so much.
Good to be
for
with you,
coming.
Steve.
And we'll see you next time on Tarter Sauce.
PeoriaLife.com